Let me put on the live transcript. Awesome. Yeah, so welcome everyone to our panel discussion on serving as a BIPOC volunteer. My name is Christian Olaraza Colon. I'm a dual Master's of Public Policy and Master of Business Administration student here at Michigan. And I'm also a strategic campus recruiter for the Peace Corps and the International Center. And today we have Lene Johnson and Aaron Sepulveda joining us. If you all could please introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Lene Johnson. I'm a current Master's of Global Affairs student at the University of Notre Dame from Madison, Wisconsin, and I served in Peace Corps Philippines from 2018 to 2020.
And I am Aaron Sepulveda. I'm a current staff member at the University of Michigan, having received a public policy degree from Minnesota on Coverdell, and having served in Peace Corps Togo from 2015 through 2017.
Awesome. Thank you both for joining us here today. And now we'll just go over some Peace Corps basics for folks who might be viewing this recording and may not know a whole bunch about it. But essentially, the Peace Corps is a 2-year volunteer program abroad, plus 3 months of training, which if you do quick maths, that equals 27 months of service. There are over 60 countries in which you could be working in 6 sectors, from education to community economic development. And if you didn't know, JFK at the time promised to establish the Peace Corps here at the University of Michigan on the steps of the Union on campus. Fun little fact there. All right, so our first question for our panelists, if you could please tell us a little bit about yourself and perhaps your motivations for joining the Peace Corps.
Yeah, I can start. So like I said, I'm from Madison, Wisconsin. I got my BA in Legal Studies and Psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And while there, I studied abroad in Cape Town. And I realized while I was there and taking a lot of foreign policy classes that I was really interested in doing something in the international realm. At the time, I was really interested in law, and I thought I would go down the track of like international human rights law. But when I was getting closer to graduation, I wanted some time off from school because I was really burnt out. So Peace Corps was kind of a great opportunity for me to combine my interests and give back to people and figure out what I wanted to do with my life all in the same time.
I can relate to certainly like the idea of service, certainly like the want to like experience an international experience. So I think my personal interest in joining Peace Corps goes back like a little bit further, like slightly, or at least there's more background to it in the sense that I grew up and lived like entire life in Cleveland, Ohio. So I moved once in my life down the block, and the experience that I had, like being in like a low income neighborhood and then transitioning to, I don't know, maybe 5 miles down the road to like a very small private school that was also like exceedingly white, was one that made it hard to understand like I was experiencing all these differences in my life, but I couldn't necessarily like put words to them. And I found anthropology at that time, and coincidentally, like the theories and discussions of cultures really spoke to me for those reasons. But on graduating, and I don't know if you guys know, but an anthropology degree is necessarily one that's like super sought after in most professional sectors. And also acknowledging that like I'd been in the same place for like 24 years. I'd never been to Canada. Canada's like 100 miles away, but I'd never been anywhere. I was like, Peace Corps is the ideal for me. Like it combines my interest in serving people, which is sort of like something I got from my mother. It combines my academic interest that I had at the time, and it gave me this opportunity to go see part of the world that I never would, and understand like on a firsthand level like what culture shock was. And so my first time leaving the country was to go to Togo, West Africa, which like if Africa is like a little pea is like right here, it is the size of Kentucky or something. Small place.
Awesome. Thank you both for sharing. I think for me as well, and just to provide context, because I realized I didn't say where I served, but I was a volunteer in the Philippines with Lene between 2018 and 2020. You know, kind of hitting on both of the conversations that you just shared with us. For me, I had studied international relations with concentration on the Middle East and Central Asia. I had the opportunity to live and work in Turkey and in Azerbaijan for a bit of time in my undergrad. But I also knew that I wanted to go to grad school and I wanted to, you know, study public policy because I was very service oriented at the time. And for me, I knew that a great way to kind of combine my interest in international relations and public service was to join the Peace Corps. But I also wanted to expand my horizons outside of the Middle East and Central Asia. And for me, that took me to the Philippines and Southeast Asia. So it was a great opportunity to just, you know, expand my horizons and learn about a region that I had very little knowledge on, and just be open to it. And thankfully, I did have a relatively positive experience, and just kind of relating the parallels between the Philippines and Puerto Rico, where I'm from, was definitely a point that continued to spark my interest during my time there. So the next question I have is if you could provide us with a bit of context of what your day-to-day life was while you were in service.
Yeah, so like I said, I was in the Philippines. I was in an island called Bohol. I was in a city, so I had a very different Peace Corps experience from what is typically thought of as the Peace Corps experience. So like I was in a city with like 3 malls and a bunch of movie theaters and cafes and things, and very close to a tourist destination. So that was a very interesting dynamic of my Peace Corps service. But I was a youth development facilitator at a shelter for survivors of gender-based violence. And my main projects were working with the survivors, who are mostly anywhere from babies to 20-year-old girls. And I worked on designing and implementing a behavioral management program for the center. I facilitated therapeutic activities, did a lot of camps, like glow camps, which is a big Peace Corps thing, and some summer camps. I did advocacy sessions around the province on violence against women, and worked on trying to establish policies throughout the province to better protect women and girls. And I did a lot of tutoring, and I sat around a lot. I think that's a really big part of Peace Corps service, is you think you're going to be super busy a lot of the time, and you're really not. In terms of outside of work, like I said, I lived in a city, so a lot of the time I would go to the mall, go to movies with my friends, went snorkeling, went scuba diving. I was really close to the ocean and a really big tourist destination. A lot of fiestas, festivals, was at the beach a lot, and just hanging out with friends in general. And then I lived with my host family for 4 months of service, and then I moved out into a boarding house for the rest of the time that I was there.
I can literally not imagine like such disparate experiences. So Togo is really, like I mentioned before, it's really small. It's also really poor. So like even when volunteers are distributed throughout the country, the volunteers who, for example, like might live in a city will not necessarily be like, cities are always going to be like accessible, but I nonetheless lived in a village of like 700 people maybe in like the northernmost part, where it starts to become a little bit more desertified, like as you approach the Sahel and the Sahara. And I lived with a host family for those 2 years in it was like a clay house with a tin roof, so it effectively functioned like an oven in the summertime, and it was like an oven or it was like summer all the time. So it was awesome. It was a really, really good experience. But the actual living of that experience on a day-to-day basis was mostly probably downtime. I would say. I think that it's important to like discuss and like the possible work that you'll be doing, but it's also important to acknowledge that you are coming from like an outsider community, often with like an outside language, into a place where you're expected to kind of like change people's behaviors, and that inherently is a challenge. And it with language and cultural barriers, it makes it more of a challenge. I was a community health volunteer there, and so I spent a lot of my time being at the local clinic, which was like literally behind my house, and would serve, I don't know, probably around like 50 people a day in like fairly rudimentary conditions, for just about anything that they would have. My job was sometimes just like observing, because the staff was like so overwhelmed. And in other circumstances, I would help them where I could. You know, I wasn't providing medical care, but in situations like, for example, where they wanted to distribute medicine, like I could help with that, like around the village or neighboring villages. Like that was something I could help with. I could help with weighing children and doing prenatal checkups to some degree and intakes. I also did a lot of behavior change programming with respect to healthy behaviors that could be implemented in the community that didn't require a lot of resources. So talking about washing or helping build hand washing stations with the available resources that existed, just essentially things that people could do and adopt easily that would improve their health outcomes. And outside of that, I would also do some like English teaching, and I had a club at a local school. I think that in Peace Corps, you often find that though there are like these domains of services, volunteers branch out into like almost all of them. So I would also do like tree planting with folks in my neighborhood and stuff of that nature. And then in my free time, I would go bike to visit other volunteers because Togo is small, and so like the furthest person away from me was probably like 10 miles, which seems far on a bicycle in the Sahara, but it ends up being a pretty nice experience to do day to day.
That's really cool to hear. I was on Cebu Island, just next to Bohol, in this town called Carmen, and I would describe it as like a mid-sized town. I was working as an education volunteer there, so I was based at a middle school. My primary assignment was to co-teach English, but after a couple months there at site, I realized that that wasn't really the capacity that the school needed me for, and my role kind of evolved into, I guess, education specialist, if is what I could describe it as. Like I would work on library development, curriculum for a remedial reading program and remedial English program. Did a lot of youth development camps outside of that. And honestly, I found that work to be more enjoying than teaching, because they were preparing students for like a national exam. And I feel like that's a lot of pressure to put on someone to get them to like a certain level for like that test. So it was great that my school was flexible and switching my assignment a little bit to meet other needs. And then as far as my living conditions, I was living with a host family, but in their compound. And so, you know, very different from you, Aaron, and probably different from Lene, but I had a whole house to myself, which is not the typical Peace Corps experience, but it was a pretty nice house. Like it was 2 floors, had 2 baths, 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and like a 16-inch flat screen TV and Wi-Fi. It was crazy. But honestly, I enjoyed it, and I didn't think I would be staying with a host family, but I begged my host mom to let me stay there, and she was like, "Where else would you have gone?" You know? So she got it. And so I stayed with them for the entirety of my service, and I really enjoyed it. Still in contact with them to this day. Um, but I think the other interesting thing is like while I was in Carmen, I kind of saw the community develop more. And so like economically, so I saw like new businesses pop up, new lines of transportation. So that was really cool to see. And I'm just curious to know like what it is like now. Probably in a different state, but it was pretty good when I was there. And our town was called Amazing Carmen. So I kept that alive by saying, yes, this place is very amazing. um, Alrighty. So our next question is like, did your identity as a BIPOC volunteer impact your service? If so, how? I know identity comes up a lot while we're serving, even if we're not expecting it to. So just would like to hear your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, so I'm mixed, black and white. So I would say I'll like break it down into negative impacts and positive impacts, because yes, it very much did impact my service. I think the biggest negative impact, and I think Pasha knows this a bit, my host mom, when I got to site, was very different from my host family in training. Her and I really didn't get along. She was very older and kind of ignorant about a lot of things. So she used like the N-word and other racial slurs quite a bit and said a lot of derogatory things about Black community a lot of times. And I think that tied into like or stemmed from an overall colorism in the Philippines, which was kind of like an underlying thing throughout my service that like I think when I got back to the US, I realized it impacted my mental health a bit more than I thought. Like, because anytime I'd go away on a vacation and come back, people would be like, oh, you're so dark now. You look ugly. Like, you need to get lighter again. So I think that had a really big tone for my Peace Corps or my Peace Corps service in general. But then in terms of like positive impacts, I think it was nice because people always thought I was half Filipino. So they never treated me, I never got the negative unwanted attention that white volunteers got, which was really nice. Especially speaking the language, I could blend into a lot of context very easily. And then I think it was just cool to try to find commonalities and then share about my family and Black culture with my community in general.
I'm white facing as hell. So like I'm not like I'm not tricking anybody. I think also like if there's a spectrum of Hispanicness, I'm definitely like leaning more hard to one side of the spectrum, right? So like in Cleveland, for example, there's a very prominent Puerto Rican community. Like I'm talking about like Boricuas, like very, very I did not fit into that context as like a second generation like mainlander compared to my peers there. But I also acknowledge the fact that like I don't identify in most ways with like a white culture either. However, like coming from like this sort of like other pocket, like when I went to Togo and where I was like always 100% of the time presumed to be like a white American. Like I was used to sort of like that compartmentalization, like that didn't bother me at all. However, like it is important to acknowledge that in the same way, or in a very similar way to the way I think Americans homogenize what the experiences of Africans in different countries are like. That's how it is for African, or at least Togolese, with respect to Americans. And so, for example, for Black volunteers or for Hispanic volunteers, there was often a presumption that they were not like the same kind of Black as African or Togolese were like in that particular context, which I think or which I've heard like from my friends in those circumstances, it's hard to deal with, right? Like you like that's sort of like the cradle of African American civilization is West Africa, and then to go to that context and to not necessarily be received like as your straight identity or to be perceived as different, I think can be hard, though there some advantages. And I will say, in reference to, so there's like sort of like three cultures, I'll say, that exist in from the perspective of a lot of Togolese that I met. There were like West Africans, or generally. There were sort of like Westerners, including like Americans and Europeans, like folks who are typically white presenting but represent these wealthy countries. And then there are Chinese. And like if you are Asian presenting at all in that context, I think you can be confronted with a lot of stereotypes that don't reflect your being at all, and which can be challenging.
Wait, Aaron, are you Puerto Rican?
I am, yeah.
Oh, wow, cool. Another one. You know, there
Yeah.
aren't many,
Yeah,
many of
I got
us
the
here.
little flag hanging in my car and everything, man.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow, great. Yeah, we should connect after this. Anyway, for me, you know, it was definitely a challenging aspect of service. Just not, I think in regards to credibility as well, like if you're not like blonde hair, blue eyes, stereotypical like American, then I feel like you have to work a little bit harder to gain, you know, those relationships and like build those relationships and have that credibility. And then aside from that, just like unwanted attention and another way like things would come up is that people would think I'm like Iraqi or like some kind of Arab nationality, which was definitely not the case. But I tried to like turn those experiences into just like a cultural sharing thing. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that that was quite exhaustive. And after a while, it just kind of got old, unfortunately. But then that's kind of like when I would lean on other, you know, volunteers of color or other like minority volunteers and just like share that experience and, you know, see that I wasn't the only one like going through that. And also just finding people within my host community that knew who I was and like I had a good relationship with, and that I didn't have to kind of always be working to like express like myself or be myself with. So in that regard, it kind of softened the experience quite a bit. Alrighty. So our next question is, oh yeah, support systems. How did you build a support system during Peace Corps service?
Yeah, I'll say the first few months of service were honestly really, really difficult. And I think that's probably a shared sentiment among a lot of Peace Corps volunteers. It's really hard coming from like your first 3 months of training where you have, which is difficult in its own way, but you have all these other Peace Corps volunteers with you that are going through the same things, and you've built this support system of Peace Corps volunteers. And then you get put in your community and you feel completely alone, even if you have another volunteer that's only an hour or 2 hours away. It feels like really isolating at first. So I think that's something to like really acknowledge and prepare yourself for. But I think how I started building a support system was I started forcing myself to go to every single thing I was invited to, which was really exhausting sometimes, but it was a great way to meet like my coworkers and other people in my community and like establish a support system in that way. I think also I really relied on other volunteers in the first few months, but I think that's something I started trying to pull away from a little bit more, because as much as you can rely on other volunteers, you need to have a support system within your community too. Otherwise, you're going through 2 years of service trying to rely on people across, at least for us, across the country from you, which could be very far away. And then, like I said, my experience was a little bit different living in a city, but I joined a gym and I did yoga classes and like found friends at the gym and in my yoga classes. And then I did a lot of diving. So I tapped into the diving community quite a bit, and I found a community that way too.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all of that with respect to the idea of connecting with other volunteers, even in a small country. Like you definitely like that initial connection is really important and fundamental to sort of like your mental well-being, and moving away from that requires, and you will move away from that regardless of where you're at, like definitely requires a certain degree of challenge. I can say it took me probably like 6 months before I like fully felt comfortable in where I lived. The inverse of like not living in a city, or at least living where I lived, is that you are pretty exceptional. Like you're living in a fairly low income community, and you have like a pretty like reliable source of income, and you have like certain amenities in your life that make you different, and I think it attracts a lot of people. And so it's sort of like like you don't necessarily have to go out of your ways to make friendships, and lots of will try to introduce themselves to you. And I think it's important to, or it was important for me at least, to like engage with as many of those people like as you can, and kind of like, I don't know, tease out whom amongst those like would be good for you and good for your service. And it's definitely, it's a difficult thing to negotiate for sure, because some people are important in one aspect of your life, and some people, to what degree like can you truly get to know someone when there's like a language barrier. But I think ultimately like communities are really happy to have you in the Peace Corps, and they tend to be really engaged. And I think through that you find your people, while also acknowledging that there does exist like people who are maybe further away, but who you can still call, whether that's like other Peace Corps volunteers, or whether it's sometimes like people in the States, family and friends there.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you both just shared. The only thing I wanted to add was just like a nod to self-care, because sometimes I needed to just like take a break, outside of volunteers and outside of my community and just like do something for me. So using like the annual leave to go somewhere, at first I was kind of like nervous about using that because I really wanted to focus on my relationships with like people in my community. Um, and I feel like the Peace Corps kind of emphasizes that as well, that you should be in your community like at all times. But you do need to take a step away, and kind of refocus on yourself. Um, and I think if I didn't do that for me, then I would have had a very different experience like those 2 years. So, all righty. And then our last question is, what advice do you have for those interested in serving as a volunteer, moving forward?
Yeah, I would say my first big piece of advice would be to do your research and talk to other BIPOC volunteers and in the country that you're interested in serving in. And I mean, if you're gonna apply to go anywhere, that might require talking to a lot of volunteers then, and trying to just find out like what challenges could you expect to be facing outside of the regular challenges that Peace Corps presents as a BIPOC volunteer, I think is really important. I think something that was really important for me in my service was keeping an open mind. Navigating cultural differences is like a really key part of Peace Corps, but it can get really draining sometimes. And so I think just keeping an open mind is really helpful in trying to figure out situations that would be really frustrating otherwise. Relying on other Peace Corps volunteers, but also finding a support system in your community, like we were just talking about, I think was really important. I don't think I would have gotten through service just relying on Peace Corps volunteers. I think I needed all those little friendships I made within my community as well. And then finding something like a hobby or something else that you can do in your community, even if it's just biking 10 miles to go visit other volunteers or whatever you can do, I think was really important for me. You need something outside of work and being in your community to keep you sane some days. And then I think along with that, like, I think prioritizing your mental health is really important. Yeah. And then just focusing on the little moments and celebrating those little moments. There's rarely really big successes that you can track through your Peace Corps service. So finding little moments that you feel proud of is really important to continuing on in your Peace Corps service.
I will second I'll second all of those things for sure. Like I absolutely 100% agree with all of those things. I just think that the advice that I would give would be closest to the idea of like savoring those little moments. More specifically, or like more specific to like what I was going to say, like Peace Corps is temporary. Everything that you will experience in Peace Corps is a determined length of time, and if you hate it, you won't hate it forever. And if you love it, you unfortunately won't be able to love it forever. I think it's important to like reflect on those opportunities, and in those moments of challenges, like understanding that those temporary, but the rewards you get from those challenges and the memory of those experiences, I think, persist forever. The value that I've personally gotten from the Peace Corps is immense. My preparedness for Peace Corps when I joined it was 0, and I was stubborn enough to like persist through like that initial like total inability to adjust. But like through that stubbornness, like I developed resiliency. I literally met my significant other in Peace Corps, and we're still together. I have the position I currently have because of Peace Corps, and I also have like the countless memories and friendships that like I accrued during that time. And so like being relative in those moments, I think is really important, because it's such a valuable experience, but there are moments where it can seem a lot more challenging than maybe it is.
Yeah, well, thank you both for, hopping on this call today. I really enjoyed listening to both of your perspectives, and I'm sure the students and admin who watch this recording will also, appreciate the conversations that we've had today. Yeah, no students here, so no Q&A. And I'll stop the recording right now.